Shalom, everybody. It's good to be continuing after our wonderful Pesach break. We are going to be talking about two Parshiot today, one for Eretz Yisrael and one for people who are abroad. In fact, I'm just going to be touching on Acharei Mot to begin with, but I'll be spending most of the time on Kedoshim, which is the Parsha for this week here in Israel. I wanted to also mention, because I know that people are anxious that it's Yom HaShoah tonight, that we will be finishing at 7:30. So you make your plans accordingly. I'll try to finish on time. Of course, Yom HaShoah sends a shadow over what we are about to talk about. I'm going to start with a theme that you find throughout Acharei Mot, Parshat Acharei Mot, the first of the twin Parshiot. The theme is one of what's called Gzerat HaMelech, the royal edict. That is, that in some way the relationship of human beings to God is like a subject that is subject to a king and who issues edicts, Gzerot, which is a harsh and uncompromising word. If you have a look at sources on your page, we'll go in at number 2, but before we actually read that, I want to just read you something before that, and that's on chapter 18, verse 2. Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe lemor, God said to Moshe, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, Ani Hashem Elokechem. I am the Lord your God. And that's the end of a verse, as if that's a complete statement in itself. And after that, what follows is that you shouldn't go after the ways of the Egyptians, whose country you lived in, and you shouldn't do what the Canaanites did. You shouldn't imitate these two large powers. But it begins with, I am the Lord your God. And on this, Rashi says, very, very powerfully, he says, I am the one who said to you at Har Sinai, Anochi Hashem Elokechem. I am God, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And that was, that moment when I said that to you, was a moment in which Kibaltem Alechem Malchuti. You accepted upon yourselves my reign, my sovereign reign, my Malchut. And now that you have accepted my reign, you remember that's what you did essentially when I said, I am God, your God. That was a way of introducing myself in that mode of authority and power. You accepted that. And now the time has come, kablu gzerotai. If already I'm your king, right, in some kind of large general sense, you had an experience of that at Sinai, now the time has come to accept my edicts, to take on what follows from that, which is all the detailed and perhaps sometimes harsh and incomprehensible things that the king wants you to do. So God is introducing himself now on the basis of the authority of Har Sinai, of Mount Sinai, but he's saying, now we get down to brass tacks. Where there is a melech, there are gzerot, there are edicts, with all the harshness and uncompromising nature of those rulings from the king. And what Rashi goes on to say is that the sages were aware of what happened at the time of Ezra with the mixed marriages, and so they're forewarned, no mi gozer alechem, du'u. You should know, you should fully now take to heart who is the one who is decreeing to you. These are not just impersonal decrees, they're decrees from the one who is Ani Hashem Elokechem, or Anochi Hashem Elokecha, who appeared to you, that was revealed to you in one theophany, in a great moment of revelation. So suddenly we're down to earth, fulfilling all the details and the duties that follow on that great, that sublime moment. And then we go on, just immediately after that, in our text, chapter 18, verse 4, and that's the number 2 on your page, which is where we're going to begin the sources. Et mishpatai ta'asu, says the Torah, you shall keep my laws, mishpatim, ve'et chukotai tishmeru, and you shall observe my statutes, to walk in them. And then again the expression, Ani Hashem Elokechem, I am God, your God, which has become by now a kind of code. It's a code reminder for total authority and the implications of that. Have a look then at number 2, Rashi's comment here. You shall keep my mishpatim, the word for law here. That's the statement, that refers to the kinds of words that are spoken in the Torah in the mode of mishpat. It's a certain kind of language, legal language. And the meaning of that category of law, of language, of legal language, is that if they hadn't been given in the Torah, it would have been necessary to invent them. In other words, these are laws that are necessary for the running of society, for the healthy balance of things. These are laws that societies usually in one way or another get around to creating for themselves. And then we go to the other expression, which is always classically contrasted with mishpat, which is chukah, chok. Ve'et chukotai tishmoru, and you shall observe my statutes. That refers to things, to words, which are the royal decree. There is that expression again. What does it mean? What is the implication that it's a royal decree? That it arouses opposition. Right? It's a very dynamic comment in Rashi here, quoting from the Gemara in Yoma, but as we will see, adjusting the text from the Talmudic text. Here, this is what he writes. He says, they are the royal decree, and what is the thing about royal decrees? Yetzer hara meshiv alehem. The evil inclination, right, the evil impulse in us makes objections to them. Meshiv has answers to them. And the answers are really rhetorical questions. It's the kind of responses one makes when one feels baffled and frustrated and doesn't understand. Then, meshiv alehem, and what does the Yetzer hara say? Lama lanu l'shamran. Why should we have to keep these things? So that's, according to Rashi, that is the natural response to a chukah. Why on earth? And also the nations of the world have protests against them, object to them. It's not only our inner other, but the other out there also has protests. And what are examples of these laws? For instance, eating chazir, pig meat, dressing in a mixture of wool and linen, shatnez, and the water of the sin offering, which purifies the impure and pollutes the pure. In other words, paradoxical, apparently meaningless, right? Meaningless laws that you would never have thought of yourself, but you submit to them. Why? Lakach ne'emar ani Hashem. Because God says at this point, he punctuates these laws with Ani Hashem. I am God. Remember me. Gazarti alechem. I have decreed this for you. Iyata rashai lipater. You are not free to shrug them off. You're not free to abstain from them. How does it try? You're not free of obligation. That's right. So there we have Rashi's version of the Talmud, of the Talmudic passage. Bear in mind when you think about these unreasonable laws, the chukot, who it is who commands them. Right? It's not just a suggestion. It's the decree of that king whom you encountered at Sinai. And the thing about decrees is that they are irreversible. Right? Remember Megillat Esther, the book of Esther, Ein lahashiv. Once Achashverosh has made his decree, Ma'amar Hamelech, then it's impossible to reverse it. You have to do something else in order to subvert it, to try to circumvent it. Now, these irrational decrees are spoken about differently, and that's what is going to interest us, in Rashi's source in the Talmud, which you can see in number 3. Et mishpatai ta'asu. You shall keep my laws. Right? Again, these are words that if they hadn't been written, they should have been written. In other words, you would have to write them. And examples are given: the law against idolatry, against immorality, and against bloodshed, murder, and robbery, and blasphemy. So these are kind of understood to be natural law, universal law. Et chukotai tishmoru. On the other hand, the word chukot, what does that mean? These are words that, remember before it was the evil inclination has objections to them. Now it becomes Satan has objections to them. So notice how the coloring becomes more dramatic, right? The Yetzer Hara is our own intimate combatant, our intimate opponent. But here suddenly Satan himself, becomes mythic. He has answers to them. And what are these irrational laws? Eating pig meat, as we said before, wearing clothes of wool and linen, as we said before. And here's a new one, chalitzat yevama, the law of freeing oneself of a state of being bound to marry one's brother-in-law after one's husband has died, and the chalitza ceremony, casting off a shoe in some kind of contemptuous gesture. All that's included among these incomprehensible laws. And taharat mitzvah, the purification of the leper. And here is the final example of an irrational law in this list: the goat who is sent out into the desert, exposed to the desert, Sa'ir HaMishtalech, on Yom Kippur as the supreme and the essential act of atonement during the day. Till that has been done, nothing really counts. In other words, that has to be done at the right time, and everything else is subsidiary in some way to that irrational law. Profoundly irrational. The thing about that goat that is sent out is all the details that we're given in Parshat Acharei Mot, around the fact of its being sent out to die in the wilderness. The rabbinic laws that accrue around this have to do with the fact that originally there was not only one goat, there was two goats. All right, two goats are chosen. One is for sacrificing to God, and one is to send to the desert, which is called Eretz Gezerah, the land of decrees, the land of harsh cuttings, the land of mutilations. The word Gezerah, where reason and morality is somehow outraged. There's a kind of world of non-law, something that is outrage, puts human understanding somehow beyond accomplishment. We can't actually get hold of any meaning. According to the rabbinic law, what happens to that goat is it's not just let loose in the wilderness, but it's taken up to the top of a craggy mountain, Azazel, one understanding, which is dedicated in some way to demonic forces and is thrown off and battered and cut in pieces on its way down. Now that is the brutal, violent, essential practice of Yom Kippur. These two goats start off alive. I'll add one more important detail. And then in the Mishkan, lots are cast to distinguish between them. One is chosen for sacrifice, and the other, the lot falls on it. Both were alive, chai. It's repeated twice in the text. And they both die, but one dies this way and one dies in that very brutal way, which is not a sacrifice. It's something outside. It's out there in the desert, in Eretz Gezerah. So we come back now to our Talmudic passage here. That is one of the list of chukot here, and in fact it says, it's called that, Shema Tomar, right? In case you will say, right, Satan has responses to this, but in fact it's you who have the objections, right? The objections will be, lest you say, Maaseh tohuhem, these are acts, these are meaningless acts. These have no, their translation says, these have no meaning, and they are, they have no reason and are meaningless acts. Well, the Hebrew is much stronger, I have to say. In case you will say, these are acts of tohu vavohu, of an uncreated world. These are acts, these are demonic. They are not only irrational, but they're brutal. They somehow cut against our moral sense. Why expose this poor goat to such a brutal death? And they bring to mind all senseless acts of violence with which the world is constantly surprised anew. And so in case we say, why do we have to keep this? This is absolute nonsense. It's a much stronger expression. Tohu. It's the world of emptiness and nothingness. But pay attention. Talmud lomar ani Hashem. I am God. And there you have that expression. I am God. Ani Hashem chakaktiv. I am the God who has graven this in stone. In other words, who has decreed. It's another word to decree, a very physical word, right? It's kind of material, it's a material imagination at work here. I am the one who's engraved these remorselessly in stone. And you have no permission to wonder about them. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. We want to move into our main material. But I just want to say this. What Rashi has done in his version of the Talmudic story it's remarkable. In the Talmudic version, everything is more demonic, more dramatic, right? The idea somewhere, you're not even allowed to wonder about it. Lahar her. That is, even in my mind, I'm not allowed to worry and, to second guess it and to feel troubled by it. No, absolutely not. It's more brutal and it's more unquestioning. The gzera aspect of it is emphasized to the point of, as I say, not only irrationality, but to the point somewhere of having to overcome moral protest. Whereas Rashi tones it down. And the expressions he uses are much more gentle and within the range of civilization. He says, for instance, there at the end, you are not free of obligation. You can have all the thoughts you like, in a sense. Well, he doesn't say that, but clearly he's omitting that extreme moment in the Talmud. And he says, but the thing is that it doesn't let you off, because after all, I am God, and this is the royal decree. Now, from this, I want to move directly, and I think there is something of a shock effect about this in the relationship between the two parshiot, between the two weekly portions. We move from the one that is called Acharei Mot, after the death of the sons of Aaron, and death somewhere reigns within it, to the new Parsha, which is our Parsha here in Israel, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, Daber el kol adat bnei Yisrael, speak to the whole community of the children of Israel, and you shall say to them, the whole community behakel, they are to be gathered together in, the whole community in that ceremony that's known as hakel, and you shall say to them, what? Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy. Instead of senseless acts, instead of acts that worry us ethically, suddenly we have a command to be. Not negative, but positive. Not to do, but a state of being. Be holy. That in itself is a full statement. Kedoshim tihiyu. And we pause there. Ki kadosh ani Hashem Elokechem. Because I, the Lord your God, am holy. So the second half of the verse gives an explanation for this commandment, which has to do with you are like me in some sense. God is saying, right, it's imitatio Dei. That is where you become most like God, if you can be holy. It's not really an explanation. It's not an explanation. It's, in a way, a motivation, but we don't really understand it. What does it mean to say that God is holy? God is beyond temptations, right? I don't have a really good answer to that, I have to say, even after all my thinking and research. But let's see what Rashi says. So Rashi, you see it in number 4 on your page. You shall be holy. He translates Kedoshim, which seems like such a leap from the dark world of prohibitions including prohibitions that have that element of unintelligibility. We move now into an equally unintelligible but radiant world of Kedusha. Suddenly there's something intensely desirable and positive here, a state of being which is held up to us. I imagine this as something like a patch of sunlight in a dark forest. You know, when you suddenly move out of the tangled boughs of the trees, and suddenly you're in a clearing and there is a patch of sunlight and you're in another world for a moment, right? There you are, and there is a moment here that is clearly of a different kind from the matter of the previous parsha. Have a look at, yes, we're looking at Rashi. He's explaining now the word Kedoshim, famous translation. Hevu prushim min ha'arayot. He really reduces it, or he boils it down to something quite understandable and quite manageable. Instead of holiness, you know, like an aura around your head, you're not asked to be saints, but be separate from acts of immorality and from sexual sin, right? Two different words for sexual acts that are forbidden. Be separate from them. That is, to be kadosh is to be apart in some way, to be held far from, to be held away from the kinds of acts that are forbidden. How do we know that to be holy, to be kadosh, is to be somehow held back, to be separated? That word parush. Because every place you find a reference to a category of immorality, whenever you find sinful thoughts and sinful relations mentioned at all, there you will also find mention of holiness. Now that's an interesting way of justifying the translation. Rashi isn't just saying, well, that's what it means. That's what kadosh means. He's saying that, in fact, you have to come to the conclusion that that's what it means, simply empirically. You'll notice that whenever there is a warning or a law against immorality, somehow Kedusha pops up there as well. So you have to come to a conclusion, whether you like it or not, that Kedusha, which is so radiantly positive, really, in a sense, consists of holding oneself back from any act of immorality. Somehow a kind of reserve, a kind of movement away. And suddenly we are back in the details of living rather than in a great state of being, a radiant state of being. Prushim would mean, therefore, putting a fence between oneself and immoral acts, keeping afar from immoral acts. Ramban has a very powerful reading of Kedoshim Tihiyu. You shall be holy, he says, very famous reading. He says, here the Torah is warning you. It's here on your page. Yes, I don't have to remember it. On your page, number 5. Kedoshim Tihiyu. If you just have the laws that are written in the Torah, a person who is a Baal Taiva, you have to say it with a Yiddish accent, a person who is, how do I translate that without sounding Victorian, who is a person of lively desires, let's say, something like that, who is a person who is full of erotic desire. Such a person will find space, he'll find room to become really swept away, shatuf, like in a flood. He will be flooded in acts of immorality with his own wife or with his many wives. In other words, he'll be able to stay within the law, strictly speaking, formally speaking, but still be a person who is described in Hebrew in a very uncomplimentary way. Lehiyot b'suba'ei yayin b'sololei basar, people who are wine bibbers, wonderful translation, and among gluttoners, eaters of flesh. That means literally wine and meat, and of course it's a reference to sex as well. To be a gluttonous consumer of sex. Your attitude to your wife, or to your many wives, if it comes to that, will be no better essentially than if you were not fulfilling the law. You'll be unfulfilling the law of holiness, even though you may seem to be fulfilling the laws of purity. And you will be free, you'll feel free if you didn't have this fence of holiness, the concept of holiness. You'll feel free to speak freely all profanities, right? So you'll become someone who swears all the time, because it never really says you shouldn't swear within certain limits. Shelo Huskar Isur Zeh b'Torah. There is no actual mention of such a law in the Torah, which is the law to keep away, to keep a distance between yourself and impurity. And then one is called, if one goes that licentious way, there's a nice word for it, then what becomes Naval Birashut Torah. That is the famous description of such a person. A dissolute person who just keeps within the halacha somehow or other, manages to keep strictly okay, but in fact is a, what can I say, a lout. How do they translate it here? A sordid person, a person without any refinement at all. That's why this text now, at this moment in the Torah, comes after all the actual prohibitions have been detailed, which have been totally forbidden. Now God comes finally with tziva b'davar klali, and he now commands a more general category, a more general principle. Nihiyeh prushim min hamutarot. We should separate ourselves even from things that are permitted. Which doesn't mean not do things that are permitted. It means in some way to cultivate a certain kind of, I'd call it a kind of spiritual fastidiousness. I don't know if even the word fastidious is a very acceptable word in many quarters. To be fastidious, you can be over fastidious too. But there's a certain kind of refinement, let's say, and that is implied in that general kind of illuminated signpost, which in a way is beyond all specifics and all details. It's never written about in detail in the Torah. You have to have that in mind even when you are within the realm of the permitted, not to let yourself become totally vulgarized. I don't know what word to use. Dissolute, to lose all sense of refinement. Now that is clearly, to some extent, to be holy then, can't be reduced to any particular practice. When Rashi says you should be separate from immorality, it sounds as if it's a very practical thing. But the Ramban is saying, no, what you have to have in mind is a klal. Beyond all the details of the laws, which are mainly negative, keep away from, don't do certain things, there is a principle involved. There is a principle of being, to be holy, or even perhaps to become holy. Right? It's the word lihiot. To become holy would be to fulfill, actually, the way God named himself. If you want to be like God, as the text says here, God is holy, you should be holy. And one implication of what Ramban says would perhaps be that when God met Moshe, first of all, at the burning bush, at the Sinai, and Moshe asked for his name, you remember, it was very important to have a name, to have a handle for God. Who is this God who claims to be the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Yeah. And he answers, you remember, frustratingly, generally, Ehiyeh asher ehiyeh. I shall become who I shall become. That's a name. It's an anti-name. Right? It's a name that doesn't allow you to get a handle. Yeah? God is in motion. God is dynamic. God is becoming all the time. You should be like that too. If you are in the image of God, and there is that fundamental principle, then it's called on here in the realm of Kedusha. And why? Again, because Ani Hashem. This time, the edict of the king is not mentioned. And Ramban will say what it really means is going beyond the strict line of the law, the famous principle of lifnim mishurat hadin. that you don't content yourself with the minimum, but you try, inspired in some way by what you understand of the general principle of Kedusha, to go beyond that minimum. That becomes a good thing to do. It's an optional thing. It can't be commanded, right, for obvious reasons, because then it's no longer in the realm, what I want to call aspiration. The laws are the laws, and you have to keep them. That's called Gzerat HaMelech, the royal decree. And then there's a whole other area, well, I don't know whether it's large or small, or there's a whole other area that is optional and yet is spoken to the whole community. Everyone is subject to a certain kind of awareness that I want to call an ethic of aspiration. That is, a sense of aspiring for more. Aspiring to aspire, literally in the Latin root, means to breathe towards something. I like that. It's that kind of delicacy, the feeling somewhere that I'm not sure exactly who I'm going to be when I aspire to be and do more than I do at the moment, more than I am and do now. It's a subject that I give a lot of thought to in my book on Sefer Vayikra, which has just appeared. And what I'm interested in, there's a lot of literature on the notion of aspiration. What I'm interested in is the way in which when you aspire, let's say I decide one day that my knowledge of classical music is really quite shameful. And I don't really like classical music. I can't tolerate, anything that's in the least bit complicated. So I really decide I am going to now subject myself to a discipline of learning about it, of trying to change my tastes in some way, to refine my taste, to enlarge my taste. I have no idea what it's going to be like one day in the future when I will love Shostakovich, let's say. One day, that's my goal. Not just to listen to Shostakovich, but in fact to feel a real affinity for it. I understand. I want this. And one embarks on a journey which is called aspiration. It's called embarking. And it's called becoming. And becoming, Jonathan Lear, the American philosopher, psychoanalyst, says wonderfully, he says, the moment of aspiration is a moment of irony. It's an ironic view of oneself that suddenly hits you. I like this very much. It's very realistic. For instance, if you are a teacher and you tell yourself that you are an educator, you are a teacher, and you are pretty sure that you are being a good teacher and everyone around you regards you as a good teacher, so you have social approbation. Approbation? Yes, approbation, approval. And then suddenly one day, for some reason, it's uncanny. He uses the word uncanny. There's a moment of strangeness where I suddenly wonder, but am I really a good teacher? Right? Do I understand what teaching is at all? And suddenly one comes back to, I won't say back to basics, it's not basics, but to a sense of, it's really hard to find words for this. It's a sense of fundamental principles. What am I living for? What do I think, what role does education play in my concept of life and in my role vis-a-vis other people? And one asks oneself difficult questions and one's not so sure one understands at all what one's doing. So there's a moment really, maybe longer than a moment, it's an ethical moment. What characterizes an ethical moment is a moment when one suddenly feels disrupted. There's an ironic view of things one had taken for granted about oneself. One looks at oneself with a bit of a cocked eyebrow, oh, really? You're a good teacher? And you ask yourself questions. And at that moment, there may be an aspiration to something one hadn't thought of before, to becoming what I now begin to guess, I begin to speculate, that may be a good direction to go. And I think that is part of what's implicit in the idea of Kedoshim Tiyu, that movement of aspiration, which comes out of a feeling of suddenly losing touch with one's self-confidence. I know that I'm at home in the world with my values, and beginning to feel that I could do better, perhaps, that there are ways. So there's a kind of yearning for something else, for some kind of affirmative. So it's not just unease, but a yearning to go beyond the general social pretense of being good at what you're doing. And so suddenly, in this mode, what begins then is what Lon Fuller, who is a contemporary philosopher, calls the morality of aspiration, as opposed to the morality of duty. You don't only do what you have to do by law, but you begin to want, and to want, yeah? To desire a different ethos. In our case, an ethos of Kedusha, of holiness. What might that mean? Right? It's voluntary, but it's not really voluntary. Rav Lichtenstein said wonderfully, if I can find it here. Yes. He says, yes, it's an elitist, right, this is the way he puts it. He says it's an elitist value, Kedusha, but it's not voluntary, right? That's why I wasn't quite right what I said. It's not exactly voluntary. You are made to aspire. You can't get away from that. That's also part of what the Torah wants. And then he says, this is the wonderful expression, a Jew is also commanded to aspire. Right. There is somewhere, for a Jew, there is the commandment to go beyond, to aspire, to have a vision of some kind, which one may seem to be very apart from to start with, and to envisage then cultivating that vision and putting oneself together in a slightly different way. Have a look now at the next source on your page, and we'll see how this works out in the text and in Rashi. Number 6, why this pursuit of holiness? What is the new understanding now? It goes beyond the king's edict, the royal edict, and the irrational, harsh decree. We find in the text, a couple of chapters later, "Va'avdil etchem min ha'amim lihiyot li." If you keep the laws, I will separate you from among the nations to be to me. Lihiyot li. Strange, bare expression. Lihiyot li, what? To be what to me? And suddenly you have this, you shall be unto me. A kind of minimal expression which has mystical fullness. You know, it's like an empty space that is mystically full. It's vacant and it's teeming. What does it mean to be to me? And here's Rashi. If you separate yourselves from the other nations, then you will be mine. If in a certain way you will separate yourself from the nations, then you will be mine. Almost by logical conclusion, almost by elimination. You won't be theirs, you'll be mine. And if not, harei atem shel Nebuchadnezzar v'chaverev. What a way of putting it. And if you don't separate yourself, you will be of the party of Nebuchadnezzar, for instance. Which group do you want to be in? Which party do you want to belong to? Do you want to belong to the party of the divine, or do you want to belong to Nebuchadnezzar and his crowd? Is that really... So it's put in social terms, it's put in terms of belonging to Sheli. Where is your world going to be? Do you want it to have to do with divinity or not? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, from how do we know... This is a very famous and a very provocative statement. From how do we know that a person shouldn't say, Nafshi katsa bifsar chazir? I'm disgusted, my very flesh crawls at pig meat. That's a much more vivid translation than what you find underneath there. All right, I'm disgusted by pig meat. You shouldn't say that. You shouldn't say efshi. Lilbosh kelayim. You shouldn't say, ugh, I would hate to wear mixed wool linen clothes. Ugh, I'm repelled by the very idea. No, don't say that. What you should say is, efshi. I very well could do these things. In fact, I would quite like to. Efshi gam efshi. That's the form, another way in which the expression appears. I certainly could. I could love that, that food and those clothes. Right? That's what you should say. I'd love to have those. V'avi shebashamayim gazar alai. What can I do? Ma'aseh. So here's this plaintive question. But what can I do? I'd love to do these things, but what can I do? My Father in heaven has decreed against it. So we seem to be back here to, because of the expression Ani Hashem, again, I am God. What does it mean now in this context? It means again that there's a royal decree, except that this time it's not a royal decree, it's a Father in heaven. So the expression has changed now from a king to a father. And my Father certainly has authority, right? He has decreed it upon me. But that's a different quality of relationship. Do I want to belong to the world of my Father? Right? That's the power of his being, of the being of the Father. Or do I want to associate with a different world? Do I want to define myself by a different world? Talmud Lomar, and so that's the meaning of, I shall separate you from among the nations, liyot li, to be mine. What does that mean? That your separation from them should be for my sake. You shouldn't be separating yourself because just for the sake of separation, of being different, of being superior, of having a superiority complex, whatever it is, it should be for my sake. What does that mean? To separate yourself from sin and accept upon oneself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. And again, there is the sense of a specialized destiny. It's a specialized destiny which is not necessarily by brute force now. There is, on the one hand, a gzera, there is an edict, right? And it recurs there at the end, the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. But it now comes in the gentler tone of, what can I do? The helplessness of a child who says, oh, I'd love to go and do the mischief that my friends are doing, but what can I do? My Father doesn't want me to. Which is a different order of attachment to God. This is the order of Kedusha, of something optional, but not really optional, right? It's something that a certain impulse towards affirmation and not negation, not being forced, but on the other hand, and it's put very, very finely here, one shouldn't, in a way, take it on one's private, as it were, one's personal choice, personal taste. I don't want these things. I'm repelled by these things, by these forbidden things. Rather, one should, through the keeping away from these things, one should put oneself in contact again, in touch again, with a certain positive relationship with God, which is to be to me. Liyot li. It has an erotic moment about it. Liyot li has a kind of erotic sense about it. There is an ethical dimension to this. It can be sometimes this notion of kedusha and of aspiration can be present in choosing to spend effort to learn, to excel, for instance, in being a doctor who will be better at healing other human beings. That is, there's a strong ethical element in that choice to aspire, that choice to go beyond the minimum. Ki ani Hashem. What's the reason? Because I am God. So this is a moment, according to the Rashi that we just looked at, this is a moment that demands energy. It demands an ethical energy. You don't just sort of lie there and say languidly, oh, I wouldn't dream of doing these things. I have absolutely no desire to do these things. On the contrary, there you are, full of desire. And there you are with the ability to go beyond that desire. And to say, in some sense, to move upwards. So it's a certain kind of energy, and it's an energetic moment. And it's inspired by another desire. One is drawn to the word of the Father. The word of the Father in some way claims one. That's what I'm calling eros. That is a movement of eros, and it's a movement of identification. So aspiration is here moving one past the unthinking flux of life into an area that is a little uncanny. You know, there's a gap there, there's an irony. How am I really going to get wholly to that place? And so there is a tension. What can I do? I'm not yet in the place of thoroughly wanting to keep this, but it's a dynamic place. So here we have two modes. One is the gzera, which is the royal decree, which is irrational, rigid, authoritarian, arbitrary. It's an act of pure obedience. It has an element of absurdity in it. And on the other hand, there is Avisha b'shamayim, my Father in heaven, which is a moment of passionate loyalty to the one who decrees. That kind of loyalty that the knights of the Round Table felt to King Arthur, perhaps. I just searched my memory or my unconscious for when I have known about this in life. It's a certain kind of passionate loyalty that one has to one's king in that kind of myth, which is not just obedience, pure obedience. And it's the kind of passionate loyalty one can have to authority figures sometimes, to teachers. I have known that too. The kind of takeover effect it can have on one's individuality for good, and perhaps not for so much for good. And in a sense, this movement towards from the king to the father is the whole purpose of Yetziat Mitzrayim. That is, this is the view of the Sforno in his commentary on the Rashi we just looked at. And he reminds us that when God declared at Har Sinai, at Sinai, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests, v'goy kadosh, and a holy nation, there the idea of holiness came up right away, even before the Ten Commandments. That was the purpose of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus. And the Sforno then delineates a narrative, like it's a meta-narrative form, meta-narrative arc. And he says this, that the basic, the klal, the general desire of God, God's aspiration in relation to Israel, is that they should be holy. That is his desire, that is his yearning. And that was the purpose. That was the purpose of the Exodus and of the Revelation. Excuse me. And of the Revelation at Sinai. You shall be holy. And the egel, of course, the golden calf, was the great fallback. That was the moment when the people stripped themselves of their ornaments, which is understood to be somewhere their capacity for doing and hearing, for aspiring beyond doing towards hearing. That's the wonderful reading of the Sfat Emet, very different from the popular one. Sfat Emet says, be up what a Jew is asked to do, and that's holiness, has to do with not just obeying, that's na'aseh, we will do what you tell us to do, but we will constantly keep our ears cocked, right? And we'll be listening out for what further demand is made of us in terms of ethical and spiritual life. That is, we'll be sensitive always to the further messages of the divine in the world. Right? And these are messages that are not necessarily written in the Torah, except under the general heading of Kedoshim Tihiyu. You shall be, you shall become holy. That is, beyond sending that goat out into the wilderness and once a year emptying yourself out as a society of the violence and putting it on the head of a scapegoat, right? Enacting and God commanding that act, that mythic act. From that point, we come now to a very different point in which the people are asked internally in their inner lives to find that klal, to find that general principle of Kedusha. So now I think we have to start moving a little faster. All right, I wanted to give a couple of examples of what this practice of becoming might be. Again, in music. Music is perhaps the area that speaks to me most as a kind of metaphor for holiness, for that kind of elitist demand that's being made of the whole people here. Music, right? Someone called Erik Erikson a while ago, I don't know, maybe at the end of the 20th century, I think, came up with this idea that every musician, if he is to become a real virtuoso, a really great musician, he will need to practice his instrument for 10,000 hours. He worked it out. 10,000 hours of practice. He based it on his estimate of daily practice, 5-6 hours a day for a certain period of time. Without that, you will never become what you want to become. Right? To achieve virtuosity, you have to have the practice. What is the practice? It includes scales and studies, and I remember all this. I didn't have great ambitions, but I had, my own internal aspirations. And the idea somewhere is to overcome your limitations, your bad habits. Right? It has that kind of corrective. You can't command someone to practice if they don't really want to. If they're not loyal to a certain desire, which is a rarefied desire to become a good musician, then there's no way they're going to do it. But all right, you do want to do it, and you will become a different person then if you do this work. Of course, what is equally true is, right, on the one hand, it's true that you will, however gifted you are, you will probably not achieve greatness if you don't do this work. The parallel to it is all the details of the laws. Yeah? The laws that keep off impurity and somewhere open one up to a certain way of being in relation to God. But on the same time, someone who does practice all these 10,000 hours, all these laws, there's no guarantee that he will achieve greatness. Perhaps, that greatness is something that's not so easily reduced to acts. And something similar is true, perhaps, of Kedusha. One can be very pedantic and religious about fulfilling halachot, and somehow because something is amiss in one's inner world, one hasn't moved, one hasn't found that dynamic force in oneself, one actually doesn't move. There is no real understanding of what the aim is. The other musical example that I can't resist sharing with you is from the film The Shawshank Redemption, which is a film, you may have seen it, I probably have seen it, I think. Our hero finds himself on a false charge of murder in a prison, in a very harsh prison, in which our hero then somehow manages to go into the camp commander's office. He locks the door, and he puts on a record player, a record of Mozart's music, which goes blaring down into the courtyard where the prisoners are having their exercise. And everyone is transfixed by the sublime sounds of Mozart, coming from elsewhere, coming from they don't really know where it's coming from. So they're all looking up. So there is that, they're enacting aspiration. They're enacting looking up. Somewhere there is freedom somewhere. The sense somewhere of a freedom from their present grim condition. And that sense of that sense of experience, like an uncanny experience, again, of a beauty that comes from elsewhere. Beauty, I want to suggest, is a kind of analogy for holiness. It's something from which we are, in a way, kept away. We don't quite know how to get to it, but it draws us with a very real power and makes us put up with much for its sake. And we usually think of that kind of attachment to music or to beauty as an elite taste, but here in the film, it's clear that every last man is affected by it. Everyone is deeply moved by something, a freedom that they really don't understand. They've never encountered it before. Here too, the Kedoshim, Tihiyu, you shall be holy, is applied to the whole nation. Many details, many laws, but one general principle. There is a klal and there are many pratim. And what I want to do for the time we have now, which is about 35 minutes, is to look at 3 examples of general principles of law. We've said that laws themselves are details of the larger general principle, but every detail becomes a general principle in the Torah. It's a general law, which is then interpreted by the rabbis into all kinds of detailed situations. So we're going to look now in this way at the macrocosm of the law as it's written in the Torah. And I'm going to take 3 examples now, starting with number 7. Number 7 brings us to the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, Kedoshim Tihiyu. What comes immediately after that? Chapter 19, verse 2. Ish imo v'aviv tirau. Every person, his mother and his father, you shall fear, right? You shall fear your mother and your father. And then goes on to something else. Goes on to Shabbat, right? That's all. 3, right? Ish imo v'aviv tirau. 4 words. You shall fear. Now that is very general. What does it mean to fear? It sounds negative. What does it mean to fear? How do we translate that into the details of behavior? Ish aviv v'imo tirau. Yes. Have a look now at the Gemara in Kedushin, number 7. What does it mean to fear? Ah, yes, that's the question. Right? How do we reduce that into details? How do we boil it down into practice? Ezahu mora. What is fear? Fear is a great word. Mora shamayim, mora shchina. You know, it can be. It's huge. And here it's down to miniature moments. If you fear your parents, you don't stand in his place. You don't sit in his place, and you don't contradict his words. And you don't even decide a disagreement between him and another person, right? Even if you decide in his favor. Now, what is that? What are these particular details that for the Talmud, this Talmudic passage, really translate for the person who wants to practice the laws, what it means to fear your parents? What is this fear, which is translated as reverence here? To stand in his place, to sit. They're all negatives. Don't do this, and don't do that, and don't do this, and don't do that. And the Sforno I think very acutely says, this is not a matter of honoring your parents. Honoring your parents, which is one of the 10 commandments, right? That's the great general, principle that was given at Sinai. That's not enough, because that covers behavioral practices, what you do for your parents. You feed them, you clothe them. That's called honoring them. Right? It's an interesting definition. But when you talk about fear, it's something else. Fear, awe, reverence, is what keeps you away from fulfilling a certain impulse. What is, for the Sforno, the affirmation that is behind fear is an affirmation of one's parents as somehow awesome. That one has a certain deep reverence for one's parents as parents. And therefore, and that's how I would like to read the passage in the Talmud in number 7, you don't sit in his place and you don't stand in his place. I think, I'm suggesting that this refers to, read in modern terms anyway, this refers to the Oedipal impulse. What sons, the impulse, the urge that sons have, sons and daughters perhaps as well, to mothers and fathers, to replace them, to displace them. When the son sits in his father's place, that has symbolic power. That is the unconscious at work. And if you didn't know it before the act, you will know it when you see the son sitting in the father's place. that there, even if he didn't consciously mean to supplant the father, there is that kind of unconscious desire, and the Torah comes to say, have a reverence, that is, somewhere bend over backwards to feel that respect for your father that will not allow you to give way to impulses that you can't fully understand or control. You are in a realm that's a dangerous realm when the unconscious is alive within you. And therefore there are various things you shouldn't do. You shouldn't do this and that and that and that, not even decide an argument between him and someone else, because that is stripping him of his authority. That is a way of saying, I'm the final arbiter. These are all subtle acts of disrespect which are symbolically huge. They actually say a great deal about the failure of a certain kind of acknowledgement, right? It's a positive acknowledgement of the authority and the status of the parent. So it's a guard somewhere. To fear becomes a guard against a disparaging attitude to one's parents. And it inspires one to restraint about disparagement. That's really what the Sforno already says. In a sense, he is talking Oedipally in his way before the time, that to fear is in some way to counteract a negative impulse, the impulse to disparage one's parents. I go on now to the next source, number 8, and this we'll find in chapter 19, verse 14. It's just a few verses later, and this one says another very famous, very brief, and very cryptic statement: "Lifnei iver lo titen michshol." In front of a blind person, you shall not place a stumbling block. And here there is an additional phrase, V'yareta melokecha, you shall fear your God. There is fear again. Ani Hashem, I am God. And again, that reminder, remember who is commanding you this. In other words, again, there's great tension of some kind. You will only pay attention to this if you bear in mind who is the one who is commanding this, the special relationship you have with this authority figure who is God, and that will somehow ease you away. This fear of God will ease you off putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person, or alternatively, another version of callousness and really abuse of the disabled, you shall not curse a deaf person. Now, I don't want to talk about that one, but in the case of putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person, surely one feels a kind of instinctive horror at that. That's a taboo, you know. Who would ever do that? Why do you need to bring out the big guns to stop people doing that? The big guns being, I am God, I've commanded it, and so on. That should be something self-understood. Have a look at Rashi. Lifnei iver, before a blind person, don't place a stumbling block. Lifnei hasomeh bedavar, hasomah bedavar. It's not literally a blind person. The application of this, the detailed application, is not about blind people at all. It's a metaphor in some sense for very practical issues. Before someone who is blind about a particular matter, you shall not give him bad advice, advice that you can claim somewhere you meant well. Shelo tomar, we shouldn't say to him, for instance, sell your field and buy a donkey with the proceeds. You know, give up major holdings in order to buy minor goods and chattels. You know, that's very bad economic advice. But you can always maintain that you meant well. Don't do that, because he is blind about this issue. He doesn't know. He doesn't understand. I want to dwell on that a little further in a moment. But just continue now. V'yareta me'elokecha. You shall. Why? Because you shall fear your God. There is that notion of fearing God again. All right, this time. Lefi shehadavar hazeh eino masur lebriot leda et da'ato shel zeh letova o lera'ah. Extraordinary value here that's created. Because It's not given to human beings to know the mind of another person. You cannot imagine truly what is going on inside the inner world of another person. That's a given in the world. Right? You don't know whether he means well or he means badly. And if you think you can read someone else's mind, you have to be prepared for a certain amount of disappointment or disillusion. Right? It's really not possible to read someone else's motivations. And therefore, someone can easily escape judgment by saying, I meant it for the best. You can give bad advice, for instance, to someone, and that will be putting a stumbling block before the blind. And you shouldn't do it. Why shouldn't you do it? Because the situation is very tempting, because no one can know what you mean. And that's why it says, you shall fear your God, who knows your thoughts. Right? Do you see how it works here? You will need to develop a fear of God, an awareness of a connection with God, who is the only one who knows your thoughts. In other words, the God that you will have to create for yourself, you have to become aware of, is the God who is the exception that will not leave you completely unknown by the outside world. Right? You can't get away entirely with bad motivations, because no one will know for sure. Because there is theoretically, right, there is God. There is God. What is God? God is the one who does know your mind. So in a way you have created, right, it's only part of the truth, but I think it's the psychological side of it. You have admitted such a God into your world. And that's why, in a sense, everything is handed over into the private conscience of the human being who does it. Because no one else can ever catch him in the act, can't ever really do it, no. And only God knows, and you have to fear your God. Really what is being said here is, it's so dense and powerful. I don't know if I can really fully communicate it. I think what's being said here is that the private conscience has to acquire the strength that is equivalent to fearing the God who can read your thoughts. That is, it's really left to your private conscience. When it says you shall fear your God, it doesn't mean obey God who forbade it. It means be aware of a God in your inner world, right, who is aware of your thoughts. And develop a private conscience even when there's no chance of being detected in your subtly abusing others. How subtle can the abuse be in these applications that you find in the Talmud? So let me share this with you. A number of cases that are given. What would be one case of placing a stumbling block? If you make a present of wine to a Nazir, to a Nazirite, who has sworn off wine. You are placing temptation in his path by sending a gift of wine, even though you're not compelling him, you're not telling him to. There's no deception. Right? There's no deception, and there's not even malice, although that does sound rather malicious. Another example, don't hit your adult son. Again, don't place a stumbling block before the blind. The application is, don't hit your adult son. And again, this time there's no malice. Right? When you hit your adult son, that's not done out of malice. That's done out of authority. You think that's what you have to do, but you shouldn't do it, because you are putting temptation in his way to use his superior strength, he's adult and he's young, to hit you back, and in that way transgress a very serious prohibition, to wound the father. That is, you are responsible in some way for the temptations of the other, even if you're not really responsible for them formally. This Nazirite, he has his own morality to deal with. Why should, if I can send him all the gifts I want? But there is malice. In the case of the father, there's no malice, but there's a respect, there's a kind of emotional awareness, which is hinted at in don't put a stumbling block before the blind, right? We seem to be moving into very different areas, but that's what's in common, a sense of responsibility for the shortcomings or the emotional entanglements of others that you are in relationship with. Another example, don't act as a witness to an illegal a legal transaction that is forbidden. For instance, lending money on interest. You shouldn't act as a witness to that, and you shouldn't be the scribe that writes out the document. Why? You're just participating. You're not in any way blinding the other person, but participating is participating in a network, a social network that makes it easier for him to do something that's forbidden. And that's called putting a stumbling block before the blind. Another example, similarly, even further removed from the original idea of a stumbling block before the blind. How is it applied? It would mean lending money to a friend without witnesses. Why is that putting a stumbling block before the blind? You are being benevolent, you're being trusting, it's a good friend, of course he's going to pay me back. No, you are emotionally unaware of the temptations that human beings have. If there is no witness, you're making it easier for him, right? In other words, easier for him to renege on the debt. And then you are responsible on some level. Don't place a stumbling block before the blind. Now, I think this is quite fascinating once you look into that Talmudic area of details, of applications of a general principle. We move far away from the taboo and the horror of the original command. Everyone goes, ugh, don't do that, into very refined areas that have to do with responsibility, with human responsibility as part of the organism of human beings. And it's an organism in which greed and violence and opportunism are part of human nature. And one shouldn't dismiss them. That's part of how we live. We live with the Yetzer Hara. And if you overestimate the other person, you may be putting an impossible burden on them, that they're not capable of. So it's a kind of consciousness that has to be developed, this stumbling block, taboo. It's a consciousness of the shady side of collaboration with violence in one form or another. Okay. And having said that, I think we can now move on. Yes, the ethics of aspiration. We come now to the heart of the matter. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And I'll spend the rest of the time that we have thinking about the heart of the whole thing. You shall love your neighbor, your other, like yourself. All right? That's chapter 19, verse 18. Verse 18. You shall love v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha ani Hashem. Again, putting God into that human relationship in some way. I am here, my Father in heaven, my King, I am here as a potent factor in a relationship that has many ways of going wrong, which is your relation to your Rea. And I want to take every term of those three words and look at it separately. V'ahavta. How can you love the other as much as you love yourself? That's the first difficulty. We will have to look at examples where this principle is applied. But before we get to that, just to notice that it comes in a context here of all kinds of taboos, all kinds of negative commandments. You shall not, really going back, you shall not go gossiping about your friends. You shouldn't stand passively by the blood of your friend. I am God, I am God. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall rebuke. You shall not take vengeance. And you shall love your neighbor. That is, this love for the other comes into that dark forest of revenge and violence and hatred, which is the field of human of human interactions in society. And suddenly here you have this love, v'ahavta, like that burst of sunlight that I was in the tangled forest that I was talking about before. Right. Ze klal gadol b'Torah, Rabbi Akiva said. This is the great general principle of the Torah, to love your other like yourself, foundational principle. But isn't it unrealistic? Ramban, for instance, in a way acknowledges that it is unrealistic. Yeah. What do we have here? V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. He says that's impossible. That's a haflaga. You can't love someone else as you love yourself. Adam karov la'atzmo. So again, that's the way we're built, with kind of inbuilt narcissism, that we come first. And in fact, there is even a law that says, the famous one about the Rabbi Akiva, if you have one bottle of water in the wilderness between you and the other person, if it's your bottle of water, your life comes first. So there's an acknowledgement of that, again, that fact of reality. So what does it mean to love as much as yourself? So Ramban, again, he reduces it slightly. He says, this is a behavioral command. You should act benevolently. You should want his welfare as much as you want. It isn't a matter of emotional love. You can't love anyone else. But you can avoid envy of your... In other words, you can struggle with the natural desire that I should have it just a little bit better than he has it. I'm sorry to sound so... that's a kind of terrible realism that we're engaged in here. I want everything should be good with you, but I want to be just a little bit better. That we should in some way struggle against that. That's the area of struggle, to struggle against, I think the word is envy. Envy which divides us. And it may be a losing battle, but perhaps, somewhere it'll have an effect. A person shouldn't place lo yiten shi'urin ba'ahava. It's very beautiful expression. You shouldn't give rations to love. Well, I love myself just this bit more than that. I keep him a little bit on short rations because I want to love myself more. Try to be more generous. Try to be less calculating about the whole thing. That's one comment. Freud thought that this was an impossible command. And he says the inflation of love here, that you can love someone else as much as you love yourself, lowers its value. That's not really love. And he says to inflate it in this way doesn't get rid of the difficulty of keeping this law, but it really just represents the cultural superego. That is, this is the policeman's voice in one's conscience, in one's society, telling one, no, you have to love him as much as you love yourself. And it's a defense against natural aggressiveness, but it's impossible to fulfill. It causes suffering, he says, without effecting change. It's a useless exaggeration of what is possible. And again, it's the superego that's at work, and that's a harsh voice that's speaking, and it causes frustration, not inspiration. He says it's a very unpsychological command. Well, Freud has now disposed of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Ramban also says it's a haflaga. It's an exaggeration of some kind. It's a figure of speech. It suggests something rather than really meaning literally you should love him as much or more, as much as you love yourself. What about your reacha? Who is your reacha? Who is it that you're supposed to love in this way? Reacha is not your friend. I want to start by making that point on reacha. Reacha is simply the other person with whom you happen to find yourself. And this other person, this other person, one moment. Who are you in relation to this other person? You are the one who is tempted on occasion to stand by and watch passively while he is killed, to hate him in your heart. In other words, this other person is the person that you are in danger of being aggressive towards. You don't have any special love for this other person. If you want to describe someone you really love, the expression is reacha asher kenafshecha. It's a beautiful expression. How you behave to your other who is like your very own being. In other words, there's a real love between you. But reacha is it's very impersonal, and it's just the other who stands in some way in demand on you, who is a threat to you in one way or another. The applications of the principle of you shall love your other like yourself are very telling. One example is, bror lo mitayafa. Choose for him a good death. Now this is really macabre. If you are the judge and the other is the condemned prisoner and he's being condemned to death, choose a humane form of execution. Don't destroy his dignity, or don't cause him pain more than necessary. Why? Very interesting, isn't it? You shall love him like yourself. Put yourself in his place. What would you want then? So again, there's that sense of being part of an organism, right? The law says he has to be killed. And here you are relating to someone who is as little like yourself as can be imagined. He is the lowest in society. You are the highest. You are the judge. But imagine what it would be if you were in his place, and give him a kind death, as it were. Another example, it's a commandment, it's a positive commandment to meet your wife before you marry her. You should see her before he marries her, and vice versa, I suppose. Why? And here it's a little more complicated. In case, if he doesn't see her, when he finally marries her and he sees her for the first time, he finds something repulsive about her. And again, now we are in the ugliness of the entangled forest. This woman, the distance, the otherness of gender, means that in the marriage relationship there is that element that has to do with her as an object and him as an object for her. What happens then when you find yourself in a closed relationship with, poor woman, right? The empathy is now for her. What would it feel like to her to find herself in such a relationship, married to someone who finds her repulsive? So the sympathy is not for you. You're supposed to meet your wife and see her beforehand, to check it out. In other words, to satisfy those uglier sides, those less personal sides of relationship, so that you don't do her that injury of putting her in that position. And perhaps one more example, which has a similar impact, I think. One is allowed to bleed one's father, where that was a medical practice, to actually take blood from one's father, even though there is a command against it. Respect for the father, awe of the father, should prevent one from taking blood and causing a wound in the father. That's actually forbidden. But that is overcome by the idea of your father, even though he is your father, even though she is your wife, even though he is a condemned murderer, nevertheless, you should love him, her, like yourself. If you would want to have medical treatment if you were his father, and so that principle comes into active play. Now, what does Hillel have to say about the ahavta kamocha? Right? What is the kamocha part of it? L'reacha kamocha. Well, we haven't got to kamocha yet. Let's have a look at the Gemara in number 9. Ma'aseh begoy echad. There was an non-Jew who came to Shammai, and he said to him, please make me Jewish, convert me, if on the condition that you teach me the whole Torah while I'm standing on one foot. The English translation got a little bit condensed here for some reason. While I'm standing on one foot. Shammai threw him out. He was just disgusted at this provocative invitation by the ger, or demand by the ger. I'm standing on one foot, that's just a provocation. Then he went to Hillel, and he said, please convert me on the same grounds. And Hillel is much more helpful, and he answers, what is hateful to you, don't do to the other. That is the whole Torah. All the rest is commentary. Now go and learn. All the rest, what is hateful, don't do to the other. That's the whole Torah. In other words, the klal of the Torah is contained in that statement. But it's not enough to know that statement. Now go and learn all the details, all the applications of that statement. Some are obvious and some are difficult and some are not obvious at all, as we have seen. The other who is really other. So without all the details, you will not really know how to practice loving the other like yourself. But the other thing is also true. The other way is also true. Without knowing that what the general principle is, all your practice of these particular laws will not be based on any true understanding at all. Now, it's Rav Dessler who makes this point, great Musar thinker of the last century, who I was very influenced by when I was quite young. And he makes this really rather wonderful statement. He says, oh, of course you lose out if you don't look at the details, and find out how you actually do this. But you lose out even more if you don't understand that behind all these details, there is a principle here of loving the other who is just like you. And so he transfers the kamocha from an adverb to an adjective, yes? It's not the love is like you love for yourself, it's the you are just like the other. The other is just like you. On some basic, foundational mode, to be just like you because you're both in the image of God, or alternatively, and perhaps it comes to the same thing, because your other, like yourself, is also disoriented in the world, is also in some way, I look at the other and I see a mirror of my own instability, of the split, of the gap in myself, of the sense that I have that I am strange to myself. I'm referring to a book by Eric Zandner in which he says the other has an unconscious. He is the bearer of an irreducible and internal otherness. He has a touch of madness. He's disoriented in the world. Now, one has to go very far into one's inner world to realize that about oneself, and therefore to acquire a kind of tenderness for the other, which is based on the same tenderness that one hopefully acquires for oneself, and ability then to think of oneself not as being, but as becoming. That one is, nevertheless, in the image of God, and therefore there are new possibilities. There are new possibilities always of aspiring towards something further. Now, this klal gadol, what does it give us? What does the general principle give us that you can't get by just reading all the rabbinic laws and all their later, further detailing in later centuries? Doing everything right and avoiding doing things wrong is only part of the story, and it's the less important part, Rav Dessler is saying. The more important part is the inner state, the sensibility that one has, that values truth and love and holiness, yeah, Kedoshim tihiyu ve'ahavta, that for whom these are provocative ideals. There is something that suggests a largeness of connection with the world and with the organism of society, in which simply doing something dramatic to get rid of evil, smashing the goat on the rocks. All right, one does that once a year as atonement. But the day-to-day work has to mean the cultivation of a klal. And the klal is one of holiness or of loving your neighbor like yourself, who is like yourself. And what you get from the klal that you can't get from any of the details alone is, if I can put it like this, is the strangeness of the klal. The klal, be holy, love your neighbor as yourself. It comes across as really mysterious, as somewhere, strange, uncanny. What do I understand by that? It's impossible. It's too big. It's unfathomable in some way. And that sense of strangeness is what creates a dynamic inner life, a capacity to bring in a God that one can fear in the sense not of obedience, but in the sense of constantly listening out for what further thing that the divine wants of me. The reminders to become, right? The reminders to become. The reminders to become holy, impossible, and the reminders to love, equally impossible. And yet the inner impulse is that which opens one up and provides perhaps the only really effective impulse that can help us perhaps move beyond the eternal return of violence and evil, move toward, from that place. Maybe that the world should move beyond that place. What needs to be done is cultivation of an inner sense of things that will in some way move us on through acts, but perhaps even more through sensibility and through certain kinds of awareness and consciousness. Thank you very much. We stop there. And we meet again, Yimets Hashem, in 2 weeks' time. And 2 weeks' time we'll be in brighter territory, perhaps, and that will be Parshat Bahar. Shalom, shalom.